It's been described as a slow-motion genocide, and it's happening right on Australia's doorstep. The situation in West Papua is complex. Land and resources, race and religion, power and poverty, but the end result is brutal in its simplicity. People are suffering, people are dying. And a warning, the details of the human rights abuses we'll be discussing today may be distressing for some listeners.
This is Signs of the Times Radio with Kent Kingston.
Hey, it's great to have you on Signs of the Times Radio this week. I'm zooming across the border, the forbidden Victorian border, to Elizabeth Kendal. How are you, Elizabeth?
I'm very well, thank goodness for that, Kent.
Yes. Things are a little scary in Victoria right now. You've become the pariah of Australia lately in some ways. But yeah, we're all very concerned about the rate of COVID infections there. It seems terrible.
Yeah, it's not surprising, really. Victoria has long been the most radical state in all of Australia. So, there's a bit of civil disobedience going on, I think, down here, and it's spreading.
Yeah. No, it's a bit of a worry, and we're certainly, our thoughts are with you guys, and hope that we see this spike, flattening out soon. Now, Elizabeth, you wear a number of different hats in academia, in research, and I guess journalism, you could call it. Could you just introduce us to you? Who is Elizabeth Kendal?
Well, that's a really long story. Look, I'm a single mum with four, a divorced woman, 4 adult children now. So they're all grown up. So I live alone with my Labrador now in the Dandenong Ranges. It's a very beautiful part of Victoria. Like, we've got tropical rainforest, subtropical rainforest there. So it's very lovely.
And I've been there. It is beautiful. Beautiful tall trees and tree ferns. And it's fantastic. Yeah.
Lovely spot. So I'm very happy there. Many years ago, when I was really praying, thinking that my opportunities to be involved in Christian ministry were now over, which was devastating to me because I always envisaged my life being involved in Christian ministry. I was really praying that God would show me what he wanted me to do. And I prayed like that for a number of years, really. It was several years. And then this incident in Upper Egypt just caught my eye. It was a little bit on the news. The Copts, that's the indigenous people of Egypt, Copts in Sydney had a street march to protest this terrible human rights abuses in Upper Egypt. Right. This was in 1998. And they said on the news that over 1,000 Copts in Upper Egypt in this village had been arrested and tortured. And then they just went on with the football or something, the football news, and I thought, what? That is so big. Why isn't this a bigger story? And I couldn't work out what had gone on. I couldn't find it in the news. And this is early days of internet. But I managed to, God had got me on the hook, right? And he was reeling me in. And I discovered through the International Coptic Association that some Copts had been murdered. And in order not to have the perpetrators put on trial, because they were a Muslim gang, they arrested the whole village under emergency laws, all the Christians in the village, and tortured them until they got someone confessing to the crime.
Okay, so because Copts are members of the Coptic Orthodox Church.
That's right, yeah. So they're the indigenous people of Egypt. They're the descendants of the pharaohs. They were there before the Arabs came in, and they've remained Christian, but they're about 10% of the population. And when I realised what had happened to these people, it really, God had caught me at that point, and I realised, how can we help these people if we don't even know what's happening to them and we don't understand what's happening to them? It's just reported as it was only on the news because the Copts marched through the streets of Sydney and held up the traffic. And
Wow.
so at that point, I thought, no, my life will be now devoted to helping people know what's going on with, these really vulnerable peoples, and especially to help the church, the Christian church, know what is happening to really severely persecuted Christian minorities in the world, in Pakistan, in India, in Egypt, and all across the Middle East. Christian groups that are really suffering terribly, and we never hear about it. It's not newsworthy. No one cares. So
Mm.
that became the ministry that God called me to, and that I've been working at for the last more than 20 years.
Wow. Okay. So, Elizabeth, you mentioned a couple of places around the world where Christians are being persecuted now, or have been, persecuted recently. Are these sort of the hotspots, or are there particular hotspots right now, or places where the persecution of Christians has been a persistent issue, in recent years, recent decades?
Well, it's escalated across the world in recent decades, and a lot of it, there are lots of reasons for it. And I go into this on my website, elizabethkendal.com. I explain some of the global trends that have converged to make religion a really hot issue in the world.
Mm.
I mean, people in the West think we're becoming post-religious, post-Christian. As we become scientific, we'll give up our religion. But it's actually not true at all. Religion is hotter now than it has been for a long time.
Mm.
And the Christian church is growing extraordinarily in the non-Western world. And at the same time, you've got the rise of Hindu nationalism in India.
Mm.
You've got this revival of fundamentalist Islam, which is intensely intolerant all through the Muslim world. And then you've got, since the fall of communism in Europe, you've got a real stepping up just in the last decade, really, of communism in communist control in China, where then they're not going to go the way of the Soviet Union. They
Mm.
are digging in big time. And under Xi Jinping, China is becoming a real serious hotspot for persecution, along with India and Pakistan and right across the Middle East, large tracts of the world.
Mm. I guess one question that some people might be asking themselves as they listen to you, Elizabeth, is why focus specifically on the persecution of Christians? Because there are all kinds of minority groups who are being persecuted for all kinds of reasons. I mean, think of in Sri Lanka, for example, the Tamils who are traditionally Hindu are often persecuted by the Buddhist majority Sinhalese, or the Rohingya in Myanmar, persecuted by the Buddhist majority Burmese. Why Christians in particular? I guess, and because some of these issues, like the Rohingya, are fairly well known, but others are not. I mean, I was reading last week about Burkina Faso, for example, where there are Fulani nomadic herders in Burkina Faso who are being persecuted by the government there, which is actually, I think, the elites are a Christian majority in Burkina Faso, even though the majority of the country is Muslim. And so in that case, it's Muslims being picked on by a Christian government. It's so complex. There are so many different combinations. So why focus on the persecution of Christians in particular?
Mm-hmm. First, I'll say something about Burkina Faso. The situation in Burkina Faso is arising because of this massive surge of Islamic terrorism in the last maybe 2 years. There's been a real uptick in Islamic terrorism. There are Islamic State groups bunkering in the east, and there are Al-Qaeda linked groups in the north, and they're massacring people. And they're
Mm.
massacring mostly Muslims because they're mostly Muslims there. There's
Mm.
an Australian missionary still being held captive by Al-Qaeda. He was kidnapped out of Burkina Faso, a missionary doctor. He's been in captivity for about 4 years now. But most of the locals who get on side with these Islamic terrorists are Fulani.
Mm.
And what happens in a lot of African countries is the police are not terribly discerning, and the police can be often, they perpetrate a lot of human rights abuses themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So what they do is they just go out, and most of the police are not Christians. The presidents are Christian. The police just go out and they just say, oh, there's Fulani, they're trouble. And the Fulani are suffering because of the trouble that's being brought on their heads by the Islamic terrorism in the country. So that explains Burkina Faso a bit. But the reason I got interested, apart from the fact that I really felt God called me to this particular issue, is it becomes very clear when you start looking at it that this is a subject for a long time no one was really talking about, especially the Western media. So there's lots of groups that are persecuted, like the Shia are severely persecuted, Shia Muslims, severely persecuted in Sunni Muslim countries. Just like Sunni Muslims are persecuted in Shia Muslim countries. It's nearly always a case of the religious minority being persecuted by the majority in these countries that have really poor human rights abuses, really poor human rights standards, right?
Yeah.
So their names are synonymous with human rights abuse, and the minority gets persecuted with impunity. And the thing is, as the Christian church is quite unique in that it's not just growing in some regional area, it's growing all over the world, all over the non-Western world. So the church is growing at a phenomenal rate in China. When the Western missionaries were kicked out in 1950, I think it was, they were pulling their hair out and crying and saying, oh, there's only about 1 million Christians in China and it's all going to come to an end now because communism's, kicked us all out. Now there's about 100 million Christians in China.
Wow.
And it's because of the Chinese have evangelized their own country. And when the worst persecution was happening during the Cultural Revolution and all their pastors were thrown into coal mines, it was women. It was Chinese women who could go under the radar of the police, evangelized all the country, all the rural areas. And then after Tiananmen Square, Christianity became an urban phenomenon in China, a means of resisting oppression, So things change. And in so many countries, Christianity is growing, even in the Muslim world. All through the history of Muslim-Christian interactions, you do not see Muslims becoming Christians because it's a death sentence. It's a capital offense. It's the penalty for apostasy in Islam is death.
And there are a handful of countries that have actually put that into law, haven't they?
Yeah, that's right. And in the ones that haven't, you still don't go to, it's still illegal to murder someone, but you don't go to jail if you've killed an apostate. So the impunity allows it to happen. But the fact of the matter is, all across the Muslim world, Muslims are so disillusioned with Islam that they're not only leaving Islam, many are becoming Christian. In Iran, it's just absolutely phenomenal. There's a great movement of Muslims to Christianity in Iran, to the point that the regime is very anxious about it and cracking down on it. So these sorts of movements mean that Christians are now facing, the church is growing in countries where they are going to be persecuted. And, there are Jewish groups that support the Jews. There are Shia groups that support the Shias. There are Baha'i groups that support the Baha'is, etc., etc. When I started 20 years ago, there were not a lot of groups supporting Christians. There were, just a few aid groups but really to speak up for Christians who were being persecuted, pretty well almost nobody. And a lot of that has to do with the Western media being so disinterested and this whole Western secular idea that we're going to grow out of religion, So what does it matter if all the Christians die? There's no interest in the media.
I think, I've certainly thought to myself before, well, Christianity is the world's largest, religion. What is it, about a third of the world's population is Christian or something like that? So, which is, a large group. But I think there was a report that went to the UK Parliament over the last couple of years. Actually, they did some research, they looked at the statistics, and they actually produced a statistic that suggested about 80% of the world's religious persecution was directed at Christians.
That's right.
And I thought, wow, okay, so that is interesting. That yes, Christians are the world's largest religion, but it seems on a per capita basis, Christians are still easily the most persecuted, religious group in the world.
Yeah, and because the thing is, in 1960, about 70% of all Christians were white, Western, and middle class, sort of just like me, they look like me. But today, about 80% of all Christians in the world are non-Western, coloured, and poor, right? So they're Chinese, they're Indians, they're Africans, they're Latin American, they're even increasingly they're Persians and Egyptian Arabs and Tunisian Arabs, and so and these are all Christians that are persecuted. They're living in countries where the church is growing massively, in countries where it's not safe to be a Christian.
And they are still a minority, I guess, which is
exactly.
Fact. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, I'd like to turn to the situation in West Papua, if we could, Elizabeth, because this is the subject of our cover article for the July magazine, and we thank you so much for writing that for us, because this is, as you've been saying, so many of these issues do not get media attention. This is an issue that is right on Australia's doorstep. This is one of the closest bits of land to Australia, is like right there in West Papua, and a lot of us don't even know where it is. So give us a little geography lesson, if you can, do that via a podcast radio method. Paint a picture in our minds. Where is Papua or West Papua?
Yes, well, it is definitely off the radar, and there are lots of reasons for that. People don't want to talk about this issue because the injustice of it is just so shameful. But what I call the Papuan provinces, because it's now divided into two provinces, West Papua and Papua. It's the land we used to know as Irian Jaya. It's the western half of the island of New Guinea.
Right.
So the western half was colonised by the Dutch, and the eastern half was colonised by the British. And Missionary Aviation Fellowship actually went in with its aeroplanes only like in about the 1950s and 60s, and a land that had never seen a white face before, pretty much the interior, met with Australian missionaries. So there's Australian missionaries and American missionaries have had a big input, and Dutch missionaries earlier on, but mainly on the coast. So it was mostly Canadians, Americans, Australians who went into the interior and met with tribes that were cannibals and headhunters and endlessly at war with each other and killing each other. And they brought them a whole new way of living through relationship with God. And it was put an end to their wars. It brought them peace. It brought them health care. And the Christians set up health clinics. They brought them literacy, and they've transformed, like Papua New Guinea. In fact, like virtually all the Melanesian islands, the people of West Papua, the Melanesian Papuans, are overwhelmingly Christian. I think their census counts them as about 98% Christian.
Right. Well, and this is close to my heart, I've got to say, Elizabeth, because I spent a couple of years as a kid, missionary kid, growing up in Papua New Guinea. So, I'm certainly, sort of familiar with that sort of Melanesian culture, the Melanesian mindset, and lovely people. I always feel, very much at home there, and a very deep spirituality and deep faith and a willingness to live sacrificially. And it's interesting that there's a real contrast, I guess, with the cringe that we kind of have in the West when we think of the word missionary, and the gratitude that the majority of people in those Pacific Island countries will have when they think of those Christian missionaries who came and, as you say, transformed, what was warring battles and violence and a lot of fear of ancestral spirits and stuff like this. So there has been a real positive transformation in a lot of, not that there aren't still problems, of course. So this has been a similar thing for Papua and West Papua, but it's not actually, like, Papua and West Papua aren't countries. They're provinces of Indonesia. Now, so how did that happen?
Well, that happened, and this is where it gets really sort of messy. So after World War II, when we start to see an end to colonialism,
Hmm.
and the colonial period is over, and countries, everything, every country from like Nigeria and Iraq right across the Pacific, all gaining their independence
Hmm.
from their colonial overlords. And of course, the island of New Guinea was divided in half, with half of it was colonized by the Dutch, that's Papua, and the other half was colonized by the British, that's Papua New Guinea. And so when it came to decolonization, it happened differently.
Mm.
And the deal with Indonesia was trying to making the case that everything that had been under Dutch rule should now be Indonesian.
Hmm.
And the Dutch were saying, oh no, that would be terrible, because part of these lands are Melanesian and Christian.
Mm.
And yet Indonesia is majority Javanese Muslim.
Hmm.
And it wouldn't be right to put the Melanesian Christians under the rule and the domination of Javanese Muslims. And the Dutch fought quite hard for it.
Even though the Dutch had quite happily colonized the whole area themselves.
Well, yeah, but and they were seeing real progress too.
Mm.
They'd built schools, they'd built hospitals, they were training Papuans, and they were becoming educated. And the Javanese Muslims were a very different people. So they didn't become Christians,
Mm.
right? The headhunters and the cannibals became Christians, and their
Hmm.
lives were transformed, but the Muslims didn't. So the Dutch were very concerned about this. So it goes to the United Nations. And in 1962, they broke the New York Agreement, which was a deal to put Papua, which was soon to be called Irian Jaya, to put that Papuan province of West New Guinea or Dutch New Guinea under Indonesian rule. Now, first it would come under the rule of the United Nations. So they would administer it in the interim,
Hmm.
and then there would be a referendum. And this is where it becomes even doubly messy. Now, at the time of the New York Agreement, the American representative at the United Nations said, look, it would be terrible just to put all these Melanesian Christians into Indonesia. That would just be trading white colonialism for brown colonialism, is what he
Hmm.
said.
Mm.
He said that would be unfair. And a whole group of African nations, led by Ghana, which is a majority, mostly Christian African country in West Africa, they put together a coalition to say this would be terrible for the Melanesian Christians of Papua. It would be Muslim imperialism. Don't allow it. But in the end, America pressed the Dutch to back off because the Americans were afraid that if they didn't curry favor with Indonesia and they didn't get Indonesia on their side and in their team, then Indonesia would slip into the Soviet sphere of influence, right?
Right. This is Cold War
It's a
stuff.
Cold War thing, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, exactly the same game is played today. Indonesia gets away with incredible stuff because, like, the West doesn't want to see Indonesia slip into China's sphere of influence.
Right. And understanding in Australia, Elizabeth Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister at the time, and he similarly was unwilling to stand up for the Papuans and again let Indonesia have its way, basically.
Yep. And same with the British. They all just backed off
Yeah.
and decided it would be best if we kept Indonesia happy. It was all about keeping Indonesia on the side of the West and away from the communists, away from the Soviet sphere of influence. So for geopolitical reasons, primarily, the West Papuans were betrayed really into the hands of Javanese Muslim overlords.
Mm-hmm.
And this then went to the referendum in 1969. It was called the Act of Free Choice. And we all lampoon it as the act of no choice.
Mm.
Because what the Indonesians did was they went around and they selected, it was 1,026 hand-picked Papuans. I don't even know if they were literate or if they were just, people that the Indonesians had got on side. We don't really quite understand what was happening there, but they They got these just over 1,000 Papuans. They brought them to a station and they said, tick the box with soldiers and officials all around them. And they ticked the box and they voted, I think, maybe unanimously to join the country of Indonesia, to become part of Indonesia. And so this is the issue, you see. There's a real sense of injustice and even illegality of the way that referendum was done. And as human rights abuses have just continued decade after decade after decade, the cry for this to be reviewed just gets louder and louder. And it's really coming to a head, actually, at the moment. Things are becoming a lot more tense, and I think it's coming to a head.
Boy, and I guess where this gets complicated, and this is the case with a lot of sort of persecution of minorities, Elizabeth, is that when there becomes some sort of separatist movement, particularly where it becomes an armed insurgency, and there are armed groups in West Papua of local indigenous Melanesian people who are prepared to pick up weapons to push for independence, that seems to be when it gets difficult, because it becomes hard for the Indonesian military to decide who is a combatant, who is a peaceful protester, who is just an innocent bystander in a village. And as you were saying with Burkina Faso, you have a situation where the military or the police come through these places and the result is indiscriminate killing, all justified by the fact that there are armed insurgents out there. There is an armed independence movement. Does that complicate things, the fact that some Papuans have picked up weapons?
Of course it does. Now, the thing to remember, though, is that these are mostly tribal people with, more often than not, spears. They're not like the Fulani that are being armed by terrorist groups like Boko Haram. They're not going around with bulletproof vests and AK-47s. They're often wearing virtually nothing and carrying a spear. So
machetes and spears, okay.
So there's a huge power in difference. And at the root of it all is the appalling human rights abuses. And the trouble is, though, is that if there's any incident at all, it then becomes a pretext for a Indonesian military reprisal.
And heavy-handed, over the top.
Heavy-handed. And the trouble we have really is that there is so much, with the Javanese Muslim Indonesian military, there is so much racial and religious hatred at work that any pretext will do. And the most recent violence which took place, which was in December 2018, a group of armed separatists kidnapped 24 workers, Indonesian workers, who may or may not have been Indonesian soldiers, working on the highly controversial Trans-Papuan highway that is going to tear West Papua to pieces. And they kidnapped them and they executed 19 of them, and a few escaped. And what the kickback, the blowback against that has been horrendous. So the Indonesian military comes in force, battalion after battalion, and rampages through the Central Highlands, displacing close to 50,000 Papuan individuals. Some have died. There's about 50,000 displaced, and they've gone. Some are just in the forest, and it's pretty difficult to survive in the forest, and especially
very rugged terrain, isn't it?
Yeah. And if you're giving birth and if you're wounded, it's even more difficult. Some have gone over the border into refugee camps in Papua New Guinea, and most have gone into the highland town of Wamena, where the churches are looking after them in church built and church provided for and church funded displaced people's camps. There's virtually nothing coming from the government, and it's really difficult. So right up here on our doorstep, we have tens of thousands of people displaced by a military campaign that is deeply corrupted by racial and religious hatred, that they see, the Javanese Muslims see the West Papuans as infidel monkeys. They call them monkeys and infidels.
Yeah, and in the era of Black Lives Matter, this kind of
exactly
it resonates deeply, doesn't it? I mean, here's a people who, as you say, there's an ethnic, racial aspect to this.
Yep.
Oof.
And now in these camps, even though the church is doing everything it can, because the region is closed and because Jakarta is not allowing or not sending virtually any aid through at all, we have a situation right on our doorstep where civilians and mothers and children are dying of starvation in displacement camps. They are dying from wounds, bullet wounds, chemical weapons wounds, chemical burns. They are dying from diarrhea.
Yeah.
And no one talks about it, and it doesn't make the news. And of course, the region's closed, so you can't get a journalist in there anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who talks from inside Papua does so at risk of their life. So it's very difficult. So the group that I work with in Canberra, Christian Faith and Freedom, we've been making this a priority, and we've been really pressing Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to really take notice about this, especially to see if they can at least get agreement from Jakarta to get aid into the displaced Papuans. But we'd like to see the Indonesian military withdrawn, which I can't imagine will happen, but we'd like to see that. We certainly, it can't go on unnoted. It's coming to a head, and I really fear that in our lifetime we could see the genocide or the effective genocide of the Christian Melanesian Papuans right on our doorstep.
It does seem like it's a very difficult and complex issue. I mean, that there's the issue of the colonialist sort of legacy, and then there's these like racial ethnic aspects to it. And I understand, I mean, geographically, that western half of the island of New Guinea is the largest area of the whole Indonesian empire in terms of square kilometers, with a massive big golden copper mine like right there in the middle of it. It's but is it really a religious? I mean, are there religious aspects to this conflict? Is there Christian persecution that's a part of what's going on in Papua?
Oh, absolutely, there is. So at the core of this, it's about money, right? And it's about the fact that Indonesia could barely sustain itself without the riches that are in the ground in Papua. So it's not even just the gold and the copper. There's also oil and gas and timber and all sorts of stuff. And I can't remember. It's a large percentage of Indonesia's wealth comes out of West Papua. And the Indonesian military, their salaries are so low, they have to make up their own salaries in the businesses that the Indonesian military gets into, same as what happens in Pakistan. So they are deeply invested all across West Papua. They are determined not to leave. The Indonesian military gets heaps of wealth out of West Papua. So it's at its roots, it's about money. But of course, the fact remains that the colonizing power is mostly Javanese Muslim, and that there's a really, really big element of racial hatred and religious hatred involved. So, they don't just shoot a Papuan if he comes across them, they disembowel him, and torture him to death. And you can see the footage on the internet because the Indonesian soldiers film it and laugh at it. And they say, oh, silly kafir, and they're pulling out his intestines. And then they stick it up on Facebook to have a laugh. And there's impunity because nothing ever happens. No one does anything about it. So,
wow.
And so there's a deep aspect of racial and religious hatred in the violence that is perpetrated for the sake of money.
Yeah. Now, look, there are a number of, I guess, groups out there, raising awareness of the situation in Papua, Elizabeth. I guess my question is, as a Christian activist, or perhaps, because there are churches involved too here. I mean, you said there are churches involved in these, displaced people's camps and this sort of thing. Should Christians and church groups be joining in the call for independence, or is that too political? Should Christian groups simply be calling for human rights to be respected there? Should we really get involved with the politics?
I think what we need to do is to focus on the human rights, because that's something that can change. I really hope in my heart that one day West Papua will be free of Indonesian colonial rule and that and Indonesian military occupation. I hope in my heart that maybe one day West Papua will be decolonized and that it may be part of an autonomous state on the island of New Guinea.
Mm-hmm.
And in that family of Melanesian nations like Vanuatu, and they're the strongest supporters of West Papua today.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to see that, but if that's going to happen, it's going to be sometime down the track.
Mm-hmm.
And at the moment, the issue is so politically fraught that it's better probably just to keep it in your back pocket, sort of thing,
mm-hmm.
and to pray about it and to dream about it, maybe.
Independence, you mean?
Yeah, but I think for right now, the issue is human rights, and that the killing and the human rights abuses and the continued Javanese Muslim colonization and Islamization and military occupation of West Papua needs to change. That whole situation needs to change.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
So yeah.
So what can we do? I mean, as Australians, or this is a podcast goes out all over the world. So wherever we are in the world, is there anything we can do to help this situation to move towards a positive resolution?
Well, the thing I usually always start with is that we need to speak, right? And the Bible tells us we should do that. The Bible says clearly, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Yeah. And the Bible is just full of calls for justice and righteousness and brotherly love. So we just have to speak up. And the thing is, human rights abusers do all their best work in the dark, when no one's looking and no one's talking. So if we start talking about this, make this the next barbecue conversation, and not talking about it with our neighbours if we get the opportunity, when it comes up, rather than hide it, to be informed as well, to get ourselves informed, to talk about it when it's on the radio. Be a caller, call in and talk about it on the radio. When it's in the news, something's in the newspaper on Indonesia, write to the letters to the editor, put a comment under the article. Just keep speaking, and that way the issue is not invisible. So that's really, really important. And then it's important, I believe, as a Christian to pray about it. I don't underestimate that one little bit. I really want to see God intervene for his people here. And the other thing we can do, and that everyone can do, is write to their local MP. So,
federal MP, I assume you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's been a trend in the past, back in the days of letters and stamps and everything, where people used to write to, say, the foreign minister, and it had weight because they used to deliver great big sacks of mail.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different now, and I don't know that works terribly well. Emails regularly don't get through anyway. They're just filtered out at the desk. But if you can write a letter on with a stamp, do it snail mail, and maybe do an email version as well, to your local MP, who usually is quite pleased to receive some mail and quite pleased to have something to talk about, then you actually impact the whole party room. If everybody does it, then you can influence the entire party room. And when the subject of Indonesia comes up, there's been an infiltration of the entire party room. You've got MPs right across the party that have all received letters from constituents who have explained that this really matters to them. The Papuans, they helped us during World War II. They carried our wounded. They were on our side. And here we are, we've abandoned them to this terrible fate. It's not right. And to express their concern.
Well, worse than abandon them, I understand. I understand the Australian government has military links with the Indonesian military and actually provides training and weapons for possibly some of those same soldiers that are occupying Papua.
Yeah, that's right. Now, the whole reasoning behind that, I've had this conversation. I was told that the reason we do that is because if we can train the Indonesians, we can train them in human rights. We can train them, to have better values and be more professional. But to be honest, that's just fantasy thinking, really. These soldiers have a different worldview.
Mm-hmm.
They have a completely different worldview, and military. Your values don't necessarily rub off.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to spread like the coronavirus. Good human values. All you can do is give them better weapons, teach them how to use them really well. Then they'll go straight back and slaughter a whole village full of Christians. And there's another problem in that countries. I don't think Australia is selling arms to Indonesia, but I know that America and Britain do.
Right. Okay.
And like I'm not sure about that. I just don't know about that. But I know that the Australian military trains the Indonesian military.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely true. But there was a really terrible incident. In fact, it was one of those incidents when Indonesian soldiers filmed themselves disemboweling this Papuan man. And he's crying out to God. Oh, God, hear the cry of your people. Oh, God. And they're mocking him and they're torturing him with cigarette butts and everything.
Horrific.
And now the American bill that allows America to sell arms to Indonesia has a clause in it that says that they will not sell to human rights abusers.
Oh, wow.
So then it becomes an issue. So they sit down with the Indonesians, and the Indonesians say, well, that was just a rogue police officer, and we've dealt with him, he's been punished, and it won't happen again. And of course, America does not want to stop selling weapons to Indonesia because they make a lot of money out of it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of the arms trade. I tell you, the arms trade is one of the most wicked, insidious, corrupted things on the face of the earth.
And that's another thing that gets relatively little attention, isn't it?
Exactly.
Wow. Look, Elizabeth, you've given us a lot to think about, and I can certainly absolutely recommend to our listeners that you do check out Elizabeth's website. It is elizabethkendal.com. That's Kendal with one L. It's, just looking at all sorts of situations all over the world that we really ought to be more informed about. And I guess that's the first step, isn't it, to become better informed and then and it can become overwhelming, can't it, to see all this injustice everywhere, to think, what can I do? But I guess, we might not be able to fix everything, but we can do one thing for one situation. And that's got to be better than nothing. So thanks so much, Elizabeth. I really appreciate the time that you've given us today. And thanks for writing for us in Signs of the Times as well.
And thank you, Kent. And, if everybody throws their little pebble onto the scales, it can make a great weight. So it's worth pursuing.
Wow. Thanks so much.
Today's episode was based on an article appearing in this month's Signs of the Times magazine. A subscription is just $26 for 11 issues a year. To find out more, visit signsofthetimes.org.au. Signs of the Times has been published in Australia since 1886 and is proudly produced by Adventist Media.
This is an Adventist Media podcast.